Ooh, this book matches my shirt. Should this be the thumbnail?
1, 2, 3, let's switch this up.
Hello and welcome back, or welcome to my channel if you are new here. As you can tell by the title, today I'm going to be telling you if some of these TikTok books are worth the hype. So if you're interested to hear my subjective opinions, then keep on watching. So these are books that have been on TikTok at some point, whether it's this year, last year, the year before, whatever, or they're books that are repeatedly, just perpetually on TikTok. They have been on there for multiple years and just have never gone away. If you have been in the booktube, booktok, bookstagram space for any time at all, these are all books that you have probably seen or come across at some point or another. So I'm going to tell you whether or not I think they're worth the read. Granted, this is completely subjective. This is my personal opinion. You can love books that I hate and I can hate books that you love, and there's nothing wrong with that. So don't take anything I say to heart. The first book that I'm going to talk about is Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, and this book follows Patroclus and Achilles. It is an MM romance, and I do think that this is worth the hype. I did enjoy this. This was not my cup of tea just because this is not typically the kind of book that I read. One, it's a romance. I read rom-coms, heavy on the com part. This was not a rom-com at all. This was just strictly like a romance with like a side plot of action. Very dramatic, as Greek stories tend to be. Very dramatic, very tragic. I've heard people say that they cried reading this. I did not cry. There was a particular character. There was one character, and what happened to her at the end did kind of, I was hurt, you know, I ain't gonna lie, but I didn't cry. But I do think this was a very like emotional, this is a story that will tug at your heartstrings. This is an emotional story. It's a very well written, very beautifully written, and I do recommend, I do think that it is worth the hype that it gets. I would say that if you've been on the fence about reading this, I would say just go ahead and do it. The next book is Malibu Rising by Jenkins Reid, and this was actually the book that got me into reading. I loved this book. I could not put this book down. Now, this wasn't a 5-star read for me, especially not in comparison to all the other books that I've read since reading this. I think I gave this like either 4 or 4.5 stars, I don't remember, but this is a very good book. I do think that it is worth all of the hype. This follows Nina. I think she has 2 brothers and a sister, if I'm not mistaken. This follows them, their childhood, their upbringing. Nina is kind of the focus. She is like the oldest sibling, and she basically had to raise her siblings when she was a child herself. So the focus is kind of on her, but it does follow all of them. It also goes as far back as to like show their parents and how their parents got together and their marriage and all of that. It is such a good story. Jenkins Reid, she just does such a great job of bringing stories to life and making them feel very realistic, making them feel relatable, making the characters like come to life and you really feel like you know these people and like you're in their world. I would say that her writing is really spectacular. I really don't know how she does it. Perhaps she laces the pages with crack. I really don't know, but I have not read a book by her that I didn't like yet. So yes, I do think that this is worth the hype that it gets. So I would say, again, if you've been on the fence about this, I would say go ahead and read it. Next is a book that I recently read, and that is Tender is the Flesh by Agustina Bazterrica. Still don't know if I'm saying that name correctly. And I do not have a physical copy of this. I read this on my Kindle. I did a whole reading vlog for this book. You can go check that out. I will link it. This book follows Marcos, and Marcos works at a meat processing plant. And in the universe that he's living in, it is no longer safe to eat animal meat, and so the government has legalized eating human meat or human flesh, however you want to say it. They call it special meat. So he works at the meat processing plant that basically takes these live humans and mutilates them, you know, rips them apart essentially, and processes their body parts and packages it so that it can be sent out to butchers or grocery stores or wherever so that people can buy it and eat it. Part of what the main character talks about is that not just the fact that like this is the world we're living in right now, but he talks about the fact that like the government did something to the animals so that they could not be safe to eat, so that they would have to eat humans as a form of like population control. And I really wish the book had explored that more, and it did not, unfortunately. It took a different, you know, path, or went in a different direction and talked about, you know, followed some other stuff. It basically follows Marco as he goes through like his day-to-day stuff that he does, and he ends up being gifted one of the humans that is supposed to be used you know, for food. He's given a live specimen and he likes her. And so that is a conflict because, you know, they say you don't play with your food. That's basically what he's doing. Conceptually, this book had so much potential. I thought it was a really amazing concept. I was really interested to see where the story was going to go. I don't want to discourage anyone from reading it because I don't want to put down BIPOC authors. I think that BIPOC authors have a hard enough time getting their work out there and published and kind of getting on Booktok and getting in front of people's faces. So I don't necessarily want to discourage people from reading it, but in my personal opinion, I did not enjoy this. Like I said, I did a whole reading vlog on it. You can go check it out and hear like more in-depth thoughts about why, more in-depth thoughts about why I didn't like it. But in terms of whether or not I think it's worth the hype, my answer is no. The next book is Acotar, and I am talking about this in terms of the overall series, not this specific book, the series as a whole. Where do I begin with describing Acotar? I don't really know how to describe this series without giving away stuff that happens in like the first or second book. But basically this follows Feyre, and Feyre is a human, and her home life, her family life is complicated, and she, for whatever reason I'm not going to go into, ends up having to move to just her by herself. She leaves her family and she has to move to the fairy world or the fairy land, whatever it's called. She moves there. She basically meets this high lord named Tamlin, and due to a curse she ends up having to go on this adventure to save some people, and along the way, in the process of her trying to save these people, she ends up making a deal, and then in the second book she has to fulfill this agreement that she made in the first book, and so that leads to a whole situation, love triangle. And then in the third book there's a war, so you have all of the different high lords from all the different courts coming together to try to strategize on how they're going to win this war that they feel like they might not win. And in my opinion, the third book is my favorite. The novella that comes after that is kind of like a where are they now after the war. And then the fifth book I haven't read yet, but my understanding is that the fifth book is no longer from Feyre's perspective, and it is now from the perspective of one of her sisters and then one of the other fairies. I won't get into that because that involves me having to explain more stuff about these other books. So, do I think that this book is, or this series is worth the hype? Honestly, I do. I do think that it is. I think that the first book was very like meh, very mid, you know, but I think that as you continue to read, like the second book is by far better than the first book, and in my personal opinion the third book is even better than that. I feel like the books should just keep getting better. Now granted, I haven't read the fifth book, so I don't know if that one is better or worse. Like I said, it's from a completely different perspective. This was the series that got me to start wanting to read fantasy. Had it not been for this series, I don't know if I ever would have liked or even bothered to try reading fantasy. So I would say that if you are an avid fantasy reader and you haven't read this, then maybe you're not missing anything. But I would say that if you have not really done too much fantasy reading, if you are more of like a romance reader, I would say this is a great series to segue into fantasy. If you are more of like a romance girly and you want to transition into fantasy, this is a fantastic series to do that with. Or if you are just not super familiar with fantasy, you know, you're not like a seasoned fantasy reader like myself, I'm not either, I would say this is a really, really good series. So do I think it's worth the hype? Absolutely. The next book on the list is We Were Liars by Lockhart. I can't even remember. I think that's who the author is. Now, if you have been on my channel for a while, then you already know how I feel about this book. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. This book, I think, is maybe a really good book for someone who is new to the thriller and mystery genre. If you have not read very many mystery thrillers, or if you are like a younger person, like young adult, because I do believe this is a young adult book, again, and you're not well versed, you want to maybe get into mystery, thriller, whatever, I think this is a good book for beginners. If you are a beginner in that genre, maybe this will be a good book for you. It has a decent plot twist for, like I said, newer readers of the genre, but if you are experienced, if you are an avid mystery thriller reader, then do I think this book is worth the hype? Absolutely not. This book was ridiculously predictable. Literally, I wasn't even 100 pages in and I figured out the entire plot twist. So this book follows, what is her name? I don't remember what her name was. But the main character is this girl, I don't know what her name is, and she comes from like this very wealthy family. They have like a whole island that they like own and have property on, and something happens one summer. I think it's the summer, I want to think she was like 17, or maybe she was 15. Maybe she was 15 when it happened. Whatever, something happened one summer, and I think she might even have sustained like a TBI as a result of this whole incident that takes place this night, this one summer. And now she basically has amnesia. She doesn't remember what happened, and nobody will tell her what happened, but she knows something happened, and she's pretty sure whatever it was pretty bad. And so now I think it's 2 years later, and she's going back to the island for the summer. So she's kind of piecing it together on her own between stuff that she is seeing, memories that are kind of coming back to her, and eventually by the end of the story you do in fact find out what happened that summer. And it is a pretty crazy plot twist if you are not used to reading these kinds of books. Like I said, for me, I figured it out. I wasn't even 100 pages in. I think I was on page like 70 or something when I figured out what the plot twist was. I feel like the people who have hyped this book up on TikTok maybe are people that have never read a thriller or a mystery book before. Would not recommend this book, and I do not think it is worth any of the hype that it gets on TikTok. The next book on the list is Ugly Love by Colleen Hoover, and I haven't read a ton of Colleen Hoover. I want to think I've only read 2 books by her, this being one of them. And this book follows Tate and Miles. It's brother's best friend, close proximity. She moves in with her brother, I believe, and Miles lives across the hall. And they basically start this friends with benefits relationship. He is emotionally unavailable, and she's telling herself it's fine, you know, it's just physical, it's nothing, no emotions, no strings. But you know how that always goes. I would say that there is nothing groundbreaking necessarily about this book. I don't think that there's anything spectacular about the storytelling or just the story itself, the plot. It's really not plot driven. It is definitely very character driven. I would say that it is worth the hype, but I would say that if you're not interested in character driven stories, if you're not interested in toxic relationships, if you're not interested in emotionally unavailable men, then maybe you wouldn't find this interesting. Maybe I shouldn't say that it's worth the hype. I think it depends on who you are and what you're into as to whether or not this is worth the hype, because I feel like you have to either be able to like this stuff or be able to relate to this stuff in order for you to appreciate its work, if that makes any sense. The next book is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno-Garcia, and if you can see the trend here, I also do not have a copy of this book. This book follows, oh gosh, I don't remember what her name was either. I don't remember her name was, but the main character basically gets a letter from her cousin, and the letter makes it seem like her cousin is not doing well, maybe is in distress, so she goes to visit her cousin. Her cousin lives with you know, her spouse and his family. They're creepy, the house is creepy, and some weird stuff is happening, and she's trying to unravel and really get to the bottom of what's going on here. She goes into town, she meets this lady in town, and the lady in town kind of gives her the tea on the history of the family and the history of that house. And slowly but surely things start unraveling and things get weird, things get nasty. And yeah, it's a very slow book up until like the end. I think it's like maybe chapter 19 or chapter 20. And then it just took a sharp turn down a dark alley and things got really gross. So yeah, I would say hard pass. If you're into that, go for it. But I would not say that it's worth the hype. And last but not least, the final book in this list is A Good Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Jackson. It basically follows Pip, and she decides that she is going to try to solve a cold case. And she's a high school student. She's doing her capstone project, and that is what she decides to do her capstone project on. She decides to investigate this case. I think that this series overall is a fantastic series. I highly, highly recommend. If you like mysteries, you will love this. Mysteries, crime, all of that good stuff. The friend group in this book, to die for. This was one of my 5-star reads for 2022, so I absolutely think that this book this book and this series is worth every bit of the hype that it gets. And there you have it. Those are all of the books. Like I said, this is totally subjective. Obviously, these books are on Booktok for a reason. They are popular for a reason. There is an audience for all of these books. But just based on my personal taste, these are the ones that I think were or were not worth the hype. Let me know down below if you have read any of these books and what your thoughts are. Do you think they were worth the hype or not? And also, if you have not read any of these books, do you plan on adding any of these to your TBR? As always, my social links will be down below in the description. Be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Do all the YouTube stuff that you guys know how to do. And I will see you guys in the next video. Bye. It reminded me of like younger me, like early 20s me. I saw a lot of myself in this book, and I'm so glad that I'm no longer this person.